All right, guys. So we are now going to begin talking about community ecology. In our previous lecture, we were discussing population ecology. We talked about individuals and how they fit into the population. Are you a pre-reproductive individual? Are you a reproductive individual? Are you a post-reproductive individual? And what is your role within your population, and then how does that contribute to population growth or possibly population decline? Well, now we want to take a look at the population of interest. Which population were you excited about? And then look at how it connects to everything else. So that is what community ecology is all about. Looking at the interactions between all of the species in a given area. All right, so when we take a look at a snapshot, we go, okay, here's a community. How many different species are there? And I want you to look at the deeper picture, especially as biology majors. Don't just focus on here's the big picture, the big species, I like the fuzzy warm animals. Those are great. But without all of the different things we've talked about this semester, you don't have a picture or a clear view of the community. If you don't understand parasites, you don't have a clearer picture of the community. You need to look at the plants, the algae, the bacteria, the fungi. Every group we've discussed comes together in community ecology. This is where all of those things are going to come together, and we're going to see all those interactions. So again, I want you guys to think about every group, every kingdom, phylum, etc. that we've covered. Now let's put it together. So this is a fun part about community ecology. It's kind of like if you're baking a cake and you have all of your separate ingredients set out on the table. Now you get to put it together and mix them up. That's community ecology. So think about the different communities in Illinois. We have what's known as a temperate deciduous forest. This is a native Illinois community. So you look at the woods here, and what's really cool, this picture, one of the students from class took this. It looks like that tree got hit by lightning, but the tree's still alive. So what we want to think about is what type of tree was or is this? What was the tree's role? Was it producing food for the deer, for the squirrels, for the turkeys? Was it a nesting site for sparrows or robins? Maybe an owl lived in that tree. It has an ecological role, or what we call niche, as a producer. Now the lightning hits it. How does that impact all the species that are connected to it? The tree actually still appears to be alive. There's some buds coming out. You can see some little leaves coming out here. Now this is early spring, so we don't expect a lot of growth, but some to indicate it's alive. But the crazy thing is, how can that still be alive? Go back to when we talked about plants and we talked about angiosperms and we talked about vascular systems. As long as there's enough of a vascular system, the roots and then the vascular system connects up through enough of this trunk. There's got to be enough thickness there to support the vascular system, to carry fluids up to the tips of the branches, and it allows for that apical growth we talked about weeks and weeks and weeks ago during during the plant unit. Okay, so again, that's the cool thing about community ecology. All these things start coming together. This is the bigger picture. Here's another better shot of a terrestrial temperate deciduous ecosystem in Illinois. So you have woods here. Looks like some hickories, maybe some, looks like a mulberry, probably some other native hardwoods, hackberry. But then all this stuff here, this looks like honeysuckle, the dreaded honeysuckle. And we're going to come back and talk about honeysuckle later in conservation biology when we discuss invasive species. So what's going on with this entire community here? with this invasive honeysuckle living here. So how are all these species interacting? And when you get an invasive or a new species that's brought into your community, does that disrupt community interactions? The other temperate ecosystem I want you guys to be familiar with is the prairie. So I'll put a little text box up here. So Illinois used to have prairie ecosystems. Sadly, we have almost no native natural prairies left. I think we're down to less than 1%. Prairie has been ripped up, destroyed, and removed to make way for agriculture. But this is a prairie ecosystem early spring when all the vegetation is starting to come back. The perennial vegetation is starting to come back and come out of dormancy. So what makes a prairie ecosystem? I want you to think about the amount of moisture, the temperature, all of the what we call abiotic factors that influence prairie ecosystems. And then what is the biodiversity of a prairie ecosystem? What kind of species live in a prairie that borders a temperate deciduous forest? So how do the species interact? They go from prairie to forest, back into the prairie, or they start in the forest, come out to the prairie, back into the forest. So these ecosystems kind of intermingle a little bit with each other. And the species, some species are transitional where they move back and forth. Other species are strictly found in a prairie community, and that could be a bit different than the temperate deciduous forest. All right, so the thing to think about when we look at communities is understanding what's called the species richness of a community. How many different species are there? That's what we want to look at. We don't necessarily focus on numbers of individuals in the population. That's an important piece of the puzzle, but richness is probably more important. Richness, diversity, let me make some room here for some notes for us. Those are incredibly important pieces of the ecological puzzle. Okay, so communities with greater richness are going to be more stable. These are communities that are able to recover from environmental disturbance. So if a fire went through your ecosystem, an ecosystem that has richness in it will recover better and be more likely to recover. Communities that have very little richness or diversity sometimes collapse after a disturbance. So those are big, big factors for us to remember. Now, what we'll talk about, let me expand this back. When we look at, oh, can't do that. We look at richness is that when we're looking at a community, get that down there, every species in the community has what we call the optimal range, or call it the sweet spot. So let me get the drawing pencil. So you check out that top graph, and this shows optimal range of, this could be temperature, this could be water levels, this could be pH, this could be any abiotic factor. Let's go with temperature. And the green species loves it when it hits, and I'll make up some easy numbers. I got to go to a different color here. All right, let's say this is -4 degrees, and on this side it's 110 degrees. That is the range of temperature your community will experience. So again, think about Illinois. Winter, it gets pretty darn cold. Summer, it gets pretty hot. There's a big range in Illinois. So there's our spectrum. Green species does really well. And I'm just going to make this simple. This is 85 up here. That's supposed to be a 5. And this is 35 on the low side. So the green does well between 35 and 85. You get too cold in winter, freezes out. Doesn't survive real well. You get too hot in the summer, dies. So think about plants. Some plants can't survive our winters. We can't grow oranges in Illinois because they can't survive the cold winter. Certain plants can't survive the heat we get in Illinois. They die off. So they have their optimal range. Now, if you drop down to the next graph, the one below here, other species do really well. So the purple line here does really well in the winter when it's really cold. It's good with that. It doesn't like this middle temperature range. And then when it gets really, really hot, it does well. So all species have a zone that they do really well in, but they're able to survive in that community because those conditions, those abiotic conditions, are pretty consistent. That's what the community has evolved around, are those abiotic conditions. They've evolved around the coldest it gets is 4, the hottest it gets is 110, and all these different species have evolved. And if you notice, all the species have different peaks and different optimal ranges. There's definitely going to be overlap. You can't get away from that. There's overlap between a bunch of these species, but there's no two species that have exactly the same optimal range. If you do that, you're setting yourself up for a whole world of hurt and a world of competition, which in the big picture isn't always good. So what we see over time, over thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of years of existence, species have evolved what we call niches. What is their job? And I've been throwing this term out at you guys, let me get the better color. Wanting you guys to get familiar with this. Are you an omnivore, herbivore, carnivore, etc.? What is your niche? What is your job? So the ecological niche is what is the job or role a species plays in a community. What do you eat is really the thing we focus on. So you look at these shorebirds. You got flamingos, ducks, avocets, oyster catchers, plovers. They all live in the same community. They're all feeding in the same 200-yard stretch of the shoreline. But if you notice, each of them has their own little spot. Flamingos have evolved to feeding in the deeper water. That's why they have these big long legs and these long necks, and they can scrape the bottom of this mud and sift out little invertebrates. Dabbling ducks dip down, grab some vegetation, pop back up. You move a dabbling duck over here to the flamingo spot, it can't reach the food, the water's too deep. You move a dabbling duck this way to the avocet spot, the water's too shallow, there's no vegetation there. So the dabbling duck does well in this range of water depth. Avocets, they like to feed here. Oyster catchers, they don't like their feet wet. They stay right on the edge of the shore where the sand is softer and moister. Plovers, push them back up about 20 or 30 feet where it's drier. They've evolved to picking insects out of that dry sand there. So everybody has evolved their own little niche or job within the community, every species. Now, as the environment changes, you have to reassess your niche. Are you able to shift or adjust? If not, you go extinct. So we'll talk more about niches in our next lecture and continue to look at the connections between all the species in a community.